Today, I wanted to look at a video that Jordan Peterson made about President Donald Trump before he was elected. And in this video, we really show how unhinged Peterson can be. And he tries to use psychoanalysis in many ways to try to categorize Trump and other political figures. And I'd like to kind of examine what he's saying and kind of give a contrasting interpretation. So I'll start from the beginning, I'll stop it, and I'll give my analysis.
I suppose I've had the same problems with once and maybe again President Donald J. Trump that are shared by many. It wasn't obvious to me at all that his first shot at the leadership of the world's most powerful country was anything other than a brilliant and unorthodox marketing scheme, albeit one that succeeded beyond the wildest of imaginings. Congratulations, Mr. President. I knew him only at that point as a self-promoting, bombastic, quintessentially American-type celebrity, reminiscent in my imagination of Colonel Tom Parker, the morally ambivalent, although indubitably successful promoter of Elvis Presley. However, Trump made a name for himself in the difficult business of construction, where, particularly in cities such as New York and Chicago, all manner of corruption and trouble had to be managed. A challenging matter to keep the projects going on time and within budget. Anyone who's ever undertaken a renovation of any magnitude knows how badly such things can spiral out of control without diligent devotion of time and attention. He managed, while doing so, to make himself quite famous, another feat that is by no means as simple as those who have never done it might imagine.
So Peterson starts off by really kind of, I think, accurately depicting Trump as a showman, kind of a con artist, a media icon. And then he pivots to this idea that he's built things, he's done things in the world. And so therefore, his initial impression of Trump was incorrect. And so maybe our impression of Trump is incorrect, and that he's someone who's been able to get things done, to fight against the currents of corruption and regulation. And so I think on this level, Peterson identifies with Trump as this male actor who is able to impose his will on the world. So let's see how he continues.
Who was at the Michael Jackson concert in New York, said, when you were seated, you got the loudest applause. People stood up and roared and cheered.
So maybe there was something to him on the diligence, attention, and negotiation front that belied his mere success as a celebrity. After that, of course, he was co-producer and host of the reality shows The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice. These were highly successful, and for a long time, particularly by legacy media TV standards, running more than a decade from 2004 to 2015. He's also the author of 19 books, collaborating with various ghostwriters, and has been involved in a true variety of other business enterprises. This history of entrepreneurial activity, combined with his successful bids for attention, speaks to two of President Trump's cardinal personality features. He is extremely extroverted, that is, both assertive and enthusiastic, although more particularly the former rather than the latter.
The first thing to stress here is that Peterson conveniently leaves out that many of Trump's businesses have failed, that he's relied on being bailed out, that he's had bankruptcies, and that it's not just all success, but there is this mechanism going on here, psychological mechanism of mutual idealization and identification. So he is trying to represent an idealized version of Trump, and then somehow through association, Peterson also idealizes himself.
And also at least relatively high in trait openness, which is the single best predictor of entrepreneurial / creative activity and prowess after general intelligence. This makes him high in the personality meta trait of plasticity, which is characterized primarily by the capacity to change, grow, and transform. Something quite evident in the case of Trump, who is a very dynamic individual indeed, particularly given his age. Many people have been set in concrete with regard to their essential being by the time they're 30.
Now, one reason why Trump might appear to be open or dynamic, as Peterson wants to suggest, is that he really lacks a moral compass. He's highly insensitive to others and the needs of others. And this allows him to act on his own will without really thinking about the consequences. And of course, this has been enabled by the fact that he has constantly gotten away with criminal activity and breaking social norms and transgressing so many different social rules and expectations that he is relatively uninhibited. And that's why I think this lack of inhibition is one reason why I would say that one of the dominant traits of his personality, if we want to give it a diagnosis, is borderline personality, because borderline personality has to do with the kind of inability to regulate one's impulses and one's emotions and to act in a relatively uninhibited way, to act on one's drives. And we see this clearly with Trump.
Trump, he reinvents himself constantly and with a high degree of continual success. That can happen by chance once, perhaps twice, but if it is sustained across many decades, there is something substantive and real at work. I also followed the Donald with great amusement on Twitter during his presidential run and afterward, when he was in office, before he was turfed so scandalously by the progressive good thinkers who infested the platform, and who must be commended on their arrogance, presumption, and sheer gall. The man has a devastating and underappreciated, at least by the legacy leaders of opinion, sense of humor, although it is also somewhat ruthless. I own a very comical book, The Collected Poems of Donald J. Trump, available for purchase at the Daily Wire website, by the way.
Here he's selling a book about Trump's jokes or Trump's collected poems, which are, I believe, his tweets. But underlying the analysis here is Peterson's idea that Trump is actually very funny, but the kind of liberal, mainstream, progressive, politically correct media don't see that, and they constantly try to censor him, criticize him, and attack him, instead of recognizing that he's just joking or trolling. And so this is a huge aspect of the contemporary media culture, is that you have a lot of people on the right, and I would include Jordan Peterson, who want to argue that free speech is an ultimate value, and that anyone who tries to criticize someone or censor someone, especially someone on the right, is seen as a form of aggressive, I would say, castration of the male figure who just wants to be able to say whatever they want, whenever they want, and doesn't want to have their speech or drives regulated or controlled by the social other. And so we see here how the left is positioned by the right to be this censoring superego, and that Peterson wants to celebrate Trump's desire to say whatever he wants to say, whenever he wants to say it. And this has become this kind of defense of free speech. But what we see throughout the right is also a desire to censor anything that they think is progressive or left-wing or politically correct.
Which compiles his most memorable tweets and declarations from 2009 to 2019 into beautiful library edition hardback form. It is a ridiculously funny tome. I believe that deep.
Something that we find also in this media culture, of course, is that people are constantly trying to cash in on controversial issues or to turn everything into a source of potential profit, recognition, and power. And so throughout his podcasts and YouTube videos, Peterson is always selling something and also primarily selling himself, but like Trump is constantly trying to cash in on anything and everything.
Consideration of this proclivity for the viciously funny is also useful in shedding more general light on Trump's admittedly complex personality. First, we should fairly note that dictatorial types, a category which his enemies insist he falls into, are generally not known for their sense of humor. People were imprisoned in the Stalinist Soviet Union for being the first to stop applauding after a speech by the great leader. Criticism was absolutely out of the question and certainly not forthcoming from the top. I've also never encountered a compendium of the witty and amusing things said by Adolf Hitler or Fidel Castro or.
So here the idea is Trump can't be a dictator or a fascist because he's funny and he makes jokes, but his jokes are not really jokes. They're more like sarcastic attacks and mockery and trolling. And so I think that this is a way of expressing aggression, often masculine aggression, in a kind of disguised way. And so Trump, once again, due to his inability to control his impulses, is constantly tweeting out, almost in a free associative way, his reactions to things without thinking about the consequences or thinking about how it's affecting other people. Now, for Peterson here, he wants to argue that his ability to be funny or to make jokes separates him from past dictators.
Chairman Mao. Trump does have a surprisingly thin skin in some settings, but he can take a joke as well as tell one. He was roasted on Comedy Central in 2011, bandied back and forth self-deprecatingly several times with David Letterman. He even made a joke about getting wood during his presidential debate with Joe Biden.
Now, it's interesting because there is a theory that what really motivated Trump to run for president was that it was when he was attending the correspondence dinner and Obama made a joke about him, and that this is what really triggered him and really motivated him to get serious about running for president, was this personal slight. And as we know, he is famously sensitive to any type of criticism. So the same person who's constantly mocking and criticizing other people, himself, he can't tolerate any criticism. And this psychoanalysis, we call this projective identification. In popular culture, it's often this form of gaslighting that's also part of like the borderline personality disorder, where someone attacks someone else, and then when the other person responds, they act greatly offended and wounded, and they don't understand why someone is reacting to their own aggression.
We knock on wood wherever we may have wood. That I'm in very good health. I don't think he can help himself. And I truly like that. He's rough in his jokes, but no more say than Bill Burr.
You can't hit women. You can't. You honestly cannot. You ever see how they fall? They fall like toddlers.
So once again, what we find in so many podcasters, YouTubers, and social influencers now, in what is often called the manosphere, is this open reaction to women, to feminism, and this open display, uninhibited display of masculine violence and aggression. And so it's so interesting that he picks as his example of Trump's humor, or his type of humor, this very aggressive joke about violence being done to a woman. And that one reason why so many podcasters and YouTubers are comedians or former comedians is that they also rely on being insensitive to the feelings of other people. And this has been weaponized by the right in many ways.
And is it not the case that a certain degree of harshness is necessary for serious comedy? Understanding and appreciating this helps us in comprehending one of Trump's more remarkable features, his serious attractiveness to the working class. This is something particularly made evident in his ability to easily banter with soldiers and policemen, a rare trait among politicians, often made nervous by the necessity of interacting with real people with dangerous and difficult jobs.
So one of the things that Peterson is hitting on is this notion that the working class are attracted to a billionaire like Trump because he seems to be authentic. And the way that he proves his authenticity is he doesn't censor himself, and that he doesn't seem to like put on airs. He doesn't act as an elite. He's often seems very kind of obscene or scandalous. And once again, he doesn't cater to the politically correct left-wing superego. And so the idea is, just like comedians, he is able to kind of express what everyone wants to express, but feels that they can't express because society censors them. And so we have this connection once again being made between Trump and comedians, and this idea of kind of insensitive males.
Not forget as well that the humor characteristic of working class men and women also tends toward the rough more deeply. This capacity to relate, the variability that is so often derided as an appeal to a hypothetically dangerous populism, speaks to me of the paradoxical presence in Trump's character of a substantive degree of agreeableness, the personality trait most associated with empathy for other people, and one that seriously mitigates against the more pathological elements of the narcissism that can be associated with extreme extroversion.
So here we have, I think, one of the most questionable ideas that Peterson presents, the idea that Trump is actually highly empathic, and that this is what kind of controls his narcissism. And I think there's like many problems with this whole idea. First of all, narcissism often has to do with this underlying insecurity and the need to be admired and approved of. And that is clearly a trait of Trump, and also the idea of being sensitive to the criticisms of others. Now, people constantly kind of confuse borderline personality with narcissism. And in Trump's case, I think he has kind of an overall narcissistic personality, but also with a lot of borderline features. And so that's one reason why when they try to diagnose him, they often go between these two different things, or usually focus on kind of a misunderstood idea of narcissism, as if narcissism is just about being focused on yourself, being idealizing yourself, when in reality, what drives narcissism is this underlying insecurity that then requires others to recognize one's goodness. And he has elements of this, and that's why you can't tolerate any criticism. But as we saw with his kind of aggression and his insensitivity towards others, it's more of a borderline personality. Most people would say key kind of defining aspect of his personality is not empathy, but the lack of empathy, that he really does not seem to care about how he's affecting other people. For instance, this idea of taking over Gaza and just removing 2 million people is complete insensitivity. The idea of deporting people and breaking up families is highly insensitive. The way that he mocks other people and trolls them and tries to bully them and give them names is another form of insensitivity and a complete lack of empathy. So Jordan Peterson here is really going to an extreme distortion in order to argue that Trump is not a narcissist because he's highly empathic.
How can this be, given his rough and sometimes even bullying humor? Well, agreeableness subdivides into the aspects of politeness and compassion. Although they tend to co-vary, else would not unite to produce the trait, People can somewhat rarely be high in one and low in the other. This makes them somewhat harder persons to understand, but is something that is nonetheless possible. I believe that Donald J. is one of those people. He is certainly not polite. He knows how to behave, so is not merely unsocialized or accidentally gauche, but he frequently chooses not to. This is part of what makes him so funny. The aforementioned Bill Burr is not polite. Louis C.K. is not polite. Tony Hinchcliffe of current Kill Tony fame is not polite. Many comical people will say anything that comes into their mind, no matter what. If it is either true or funny, or optimally both, Trump definitely falls into this camp.
It's just
So one issue with comedy is, I've written a lot about this, the idea that comedy can serve a social function, allowing people to express in a safe context their aggression or their desires. But the question is, when this type of mentality, which is often based on a safe way of expressing aggression, which relies on being insensitive to how you're going to hurt other people and the consequences of your aggression, when this becomes like weaponized and politicized, and it becomes part of the media culture, but also the political culture, then it often takes on the form of this masculine desire to be able to be as aggressive as one wants to be without thinking about other people, the consequences. In other words, without having any empathy. And yes, it's true that a lot of comedy relies on not being afraid of insulting other people or hurting other people in a symbolic way. What we see in contemporary politics and media culture is often this almost entirely masculine push to say whatever they want, whenever they want. That's why like their podcasts are often like 3 hours long. They don't want to be limited in any way. They want to be able to pursue their own underlying fantasy of total freedom and enjoyment, which is a key aspect of the libertarian ideology.
awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
It is
Now, when he says you would be in jail and people clap, it's on some level you could call it a joke, but what it really is a form of aggressive speech that doesn't have much of the tension or ambiguity of a lot of humor or the critical analysis. It is a form of bullying. And so many borderline personalities are bullies, and they use their aggression to control other people. And they also objectify other people, and this allows them to be insensitive to them. And so Trump is really, as they say, the bully pulpit. He is really the bully in charge.
from the personality and psychopathology literature that people tilt towards narcissism when they are extroverted and disagreeable. Trump is indisputably extroverted and extremely so.
So I think once again, he doesn't have a psychoanalytic understanding. He actually draws a lot throughout his work on Jung, but not on Freud, and he really misunderstands these categories. And yet he's trying to apply diagnostic categories and this notion of psychopathology, which is similar to a lot of my work. But I think, once again, he's using personality traits and not underlying psychological structures. And once again, the key to the narcissistic personality is this notion that one needs the admiration of others because one feels bad about oneself, and that one covers one's own hostility with attempts at virtue signaling of altruism. And Freud notices very early on in the case of the rat man that basically this type of person has like a divided consciousness. On one hand, Freud said, your consciousness is about your good intention, but your unconscious is related to your evil intentions. And so the split subjectivity is very much apparent in someone like Trump, but Trump has this added dimension of being a borderline personality disorder, so that he's less inhibited than most narcissistic personality disorders, because narcissists often, because they don't want to be criticized and they need the approval of others, they often repress their aggression, right, and try to turn it into a positive display of virtue, of altruism. Case of the borderline personality, there is a less inhibited form of aggression, a direct desire to manipulate others, and there's this underlying, we could say, sadism. In many ways, the three main categories that Freud presents, psychosis, neurosis, perversion, the borderline personality fits more in with the perversion in the fact of sadism, and that the narcissistic personality is very much like the obsessional personality, the neurotic personality. So these are different psychological structures that use different defense mechanisms. And basically, I think Peterson doesn't really understand or care about those differences.
So definitely low in politeness, but he simply would not be able to make contact with the so-called ordinary people that love him if he did not care deep in the blackness of his heart. I have a suspicion that his very impoliteness is at least in part a mask worn to shield him from the pain that such caring can produce. This would make...
So here in this incredible rationalization and reversal, he's arguing that the reason why Trump appears to be so harsh and impolite is that he's harboring this incredible amount of empathy and sympathy for others. And so he has to hide it by this hostile veneer. And I think this is just a massive rationalization and projection by Peterson.
Trump, a man whose gruffness is there to shield himself from the public exposure of his tender heart. There are many men who are like that. Now, I don't know Trump, except from a distance, but I know many people who do. All of them have spoken to me of his hospitable nature in private and of his proclivity to go out of his way for the people around him. This group of witnesses to his character includes people who are seriously not aligned with him politically, by the way. It is also by no means obvious that Trump kisses up and kicks down. That tendency is a very damning sign indeed, particularly in someone who has genuine power and is simply not reported of Trump.
Well, when Trump was mocking a handicapped person, a reporter, I mean, clearly he was kicking down. And it is true that a lot of like borderline personalities who also can be considered to have sociopathic tendencies, they can be very charming to the people around them, to the people they know, to the people in their group. And so I'm sure Trump does have people that feel that he is nice to them or kind to them or supportive of them. But in the wider world, Trump is clearly someone who basically does separate people into groups and has incredible hostility, especially based on race and gender. And so he has a long history of making racist comments, of sexist comments, and this general idea that when you're, he's caught saying on tape that when you're wealthy and powerful, you can touch people wherever you want, women wherever you want. It really is indicative of his worldview, this idea that money and power gives him access to manipulate people any way that he wants and to use them for his advantage.
Something that appears to stand in marked comparison to Kamala Harris, who is notoriously unpopular among her staff, current and former, and for precisely that reason. Two personality traits remain to assess with regard to the former president: that of neuroticism, the tendency to experience negative emotion, and conscientiousness, the tendency to work hard and diligently and to formulate and keep verbal contracts. Neuroticism subdivides into withdrawal, a depression-like proclivity to shrink, avoid, and freeze in the face of challenge. And volatility, a tendency towards what can be an aggressive touchiness. Trump appears to me to be someone who is very difficult to stop. Thus, my suspicion is that he is very low in withdrawal. What may perhaps add to the paradox of his personality, however, is a higher level of volatility. People can and do get under his skin, as Kamala Harris did so effectively in her debate with him.
In Minnesota, she went out. Wait a minute, I'm talking now. If you don't mind, please. Does that sound familiar? She went out.
He gets reactive, but he won't quit. And he can handle high levels of pressure on a continual basis. His spontaneous response to being nearly assassinated provided clear and stellar evidence of that. What about conscientiousness? Well, Trump famously does not drink or use recreational drugs, so he prioritizes his sobriety and alertness over the transient pleasures of substance use.
I can honestly say I never had a beer in my life, okay? It's one of my only good traits. I don't drink.
I also cannot see how he could juggle all the activities that he has been involved in, even the ghostwriting aided production of 19 books, not a trivial accomplishment, to say the least of all his other businesses and projects, without a true work ethic. He's up at 5:30 a.m., a sign of the so-called morningness, the preference for early rather than late hours, which is associated temperamentally with both agreeableness and conscientiousness. Night owls tend as well to be more neurotic and to display more symptoms of personality disorder. Trump.
So once again, these are superficial personality traits and generalizations, and really just kind of stereotypes without a foundation in psychological theories, without even a recognition of the role played by the unconscious and different defense mechanisms. And so what enables this discourse is this incredibly superficial manipulation of psychological theories without any foundation that he's able to mobilize in order to argue that Trump is this amazingly empathic, well-adjusted, conscientious person.
Seems to be active and working, as well as gathering information about the state of things from TV until about midnight each day. That's a long day of movement. He has a reputation for being a veritable whirlwind of activity in general, a description I find credible given his strenuous campaign schedule, high openness and extroversion, and early morning preference, all despite his relatively advanced age. On the openness side, I suspect Trump is more interested in ideas than aesthetics. That is two aspects into which openness differentiates. He's not an intellectual, nor an artist, so I wouldn't place him in the upper echelons of the distribution of this trait. But no one average or below devotes any attention, for example, to writing books. And the number of books the typical person has written is zero. The diversity of his career is another testament to his trait openness. Trump is clearly a serial entrepreneur type, and he's also very interested in the entertainment world. For better or worse, that gives him commonality with those who inhabit the world of the arts, and is part of what makes him a very strange Republican. In
the idea that he has all these activities, that he's has all these books that have really been written by other people, that he understands the media, has nothing to do with creativity or intellect. And he's famous for wanting his briefings to be as fast as possible and to focus on him. And he does watch a lot of TV as his main current source of information about the world. And so once again, Peterson is just going to an extreme to try to rationalize and justify his endorsement for Trump.
So why does Trump set so many people on edge? To recapitulate, he is exceptionally extroverted, particularly with regard to the aspect of assertiveness. He's also low in politeness. Now that combination has some overlap with narcissism, not surprising in a figure who has been in the spotlight and strived to be for so many years.
So here the idea is what people don't like about him, or his critics, is just that he's an extrovert. It's just about his personality. He's not talking at all the fact that he's a highly destructive political force, about his policies, about his denial of climate change, about his initial reaction to the pandemic, about so many of his destructive policies, blaming immigrants for every economic and social problem, attacking every group like transgender people and women. And so by staying on this level of abstract personality traits, Peterson doesn't really have to deal with the reality of the situation, which is that Trump is this incredibly destructive figure who has enabled many destructive policies and has affected so many people. But on some level, Peterson is like one of those people who identify with this idolized figure because it helps Peterson to idolize his own aggression, his own insensitivity, his own desire for fame, for money, for power. And so he really, I think, identifies with this idolized version of Trump because he would also like to see himself as a figure of empathy, of understanding, of some type of greatness.